We do want to acknowledge, as we often do at MacEwan, acknowledge that we are recording from Treaty 6 territory. So we acknowledge that this land on which we gather is Treaty 6 territory, which is a traditional gathering place for many Indigenous people. We honor and respect the history, languages, ceremonies, and culture of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who called this territory home. And with that, I would like to introduce our hosts for today. Jennifer Askey, Dr. Jennifer Askey. She works with leaders and leaders-to-be in a very down-to-earth and engaging approach that utilizes emotional intelligence, positive psychology, and mindfulness to help her clients navigate the internal and external obstacles of their professional worlds. She brings over 20 years of experience working in complex academic organizations as both a faculty member and administrator to her coaching work, where she focuses on career planning and transition, as well as organizational effectiveness. She utilizes assessments such as DISC, EQI 2.0, Belbin team roles, and the 360s to help her clients and their organizations gain new insights and develop forward-looking plans for change. She's engaging and enthusiastic as a public speaker and a workshop facilitator. She leads workshops on emotional intelligence and team effectiveness in Alberta and virtually. She holds a PhD in German literature and is a certified professional coactive coach with CTI and a professional certified coach through ICF. She's currently pursuing certification with Positive Intelligence and the International Mindfulness Teachers Association. Locally, Jennifer serves on the board of the Edmonton chapter for the International Coach Federation and the Unitarian Church of Edmonton. And Sherry Lovely. So Sherry is the owner and operator of Fireweed Coaching and Consulting. She values a professional development coach that has been developed with 25 years related experience working with senior government officials with the Government of the Northwest Territories in Yellowknife. She holds a BA in Social and Cultural Anthropology from the University of Calgary with an honors study of the archaeological impacts of the cultural and well-being of Dene communities and their land along the proposed Mackenzie Gas Project. Over the past 20 years, Sherry has enhanced her facilitation and coaching experiences to pursue her passion in developing others. She is certified in delivery of EQI 2.0 and EQ 360 Myers-Briggs personality type and is currently working towards her dialectic behavior therapy credentials and online facilitation certification. This fall, Sherry will also have completed her trauma-informed coaching certification. After having spent more than half of her life living in Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, Sherry, her husband, and 2 teenagers relocated to Edmonton, Alberta in 2018. So we welcome her to the city. And with that, I'll pass it on to Sherry and Jennifer.
Thank you so much. So today, we're taking an hour of your lunch and want to give you a sense of what you're going to get in return. As Sherry and I go through our slides, we're going to introduce you to the 4 pillars of emotional intelligence. There are a bunch of different ways to talk about EQ. This is one of the most popular. If you've read anything in the Harvard Business Review or in the New Yorker this week, you will have heard of the work of Daniel Goleman. And these are the 4 pillars that he most commonly uses. So they're in broad circulation in both the personal effectiveness and in the business world. So we'll introduce you to those. And then we'll offer you opportunities to reflect on your EQ in each of the key areas and ideas about how to sort of boost your EQ in each of those key areas. And that will then form the bulk of what we do next week. So a little bit more practical and hands-on next week. Today is a little bit more theoretical. And at the end of the session, we'll give you some links to informally assess your EQ. And by informally, I mean they're freely available and well reviewed, but they're not the validated and normed tests, assessments that Sherry and I conduct professionally, which are also available to you with a fee associated with that. But that is our broader agenda today, and we're really happy you're here. I'm super excited to see everybody. And we can go to the next slide, Sherry. We'll cue each other since this is, all remote. Just starting with an overview of what is emotional intelligence. And as you see on the graphic here, it involves these 4 pillars that we're going to introduce you to: self-recognition, self-management, social recognition, and social or relationship management. And broadly, it speaks to our ability to perceive our emotions, our inner emotional landscape, to access and generate emotions in order to assist our thought process, our decision-making process, our communication process. EQ speaks to our ability to understand emotions and emotional language and work with that emotional knowledge in interpersonal relationships, in our ability to make decisions, in the way we think about our lives and our values, and to regulate our emotions, both inwardly for ourselves, like, is anger serving me right now, and to regulate emotions in larger contexts, in relationships, in rooms, right? Our ability to read the room and then work within those confines to shift the room, or to engage emotionally in a larger group of people. So that's broadly what EQ is. And I hope that in just outlining those 4 pillars, you can see how EQ is important professionally, personally, and inwardly. There's a lot of ink spent talking about how EQ improves business, work, professional lives. And that is incredibly true. We'll talk a little bit about that. But it is also incredibly important on just a personal effectiveness level, being aware of your emotions, how they affect you, and how to work with them.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. I'm going to jump in here and talk about EQ versus IQ. But first, thank you all for being here. This is really great. We appreciate that everybody's here. And I'm honored to help Jennifer here to co-host this. So why does it matter? EQ versus IQ. In terms of IQ, we're all very familiar that that is your emotional intelligence quotient. It's what I think of informally is your book smarts. When we talk about IQ versus EQ, again, as Jennifer was saying, the EQ is your emotional quotient, which we know in common language is emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence is said to be 4 times more powerful. This was a study done by UC Berkeley on PhDs over 40 years. More powerful than IQ, which is the book smarts, in predicting who achieved success in their field. So I just want to talk about that a little bit more. In terms of that self-awareness and being aware of how to self-regulate and know what our emotions are and what those emotions are that drive us to our goals, that's it's a little bit separate from the emotion or the IQ. This is your books. You're able to do mathematics. You have a very good business sense with the statistics. But when we talk about business acumen, we have to also include that emotional intelligence for it. So that's kind of where it falls in. The EQ scores among young adults, young people and adults tends to fall. When we talk about IQ, we're talking about a peak at age 17 for IQ. And then after that, it tends to fall down. However, when we're talking about the EQ, that tends to peak at age 40. And I like to think of it as life experience. We get to know how we feel about things and how that serves us and how best we can manage those feelings as we go through different experiences. And then they say that the EQ tends to fall down by age 50. That's that is what they say. I don't, Jennifer shaking her head. I don't necessarily agree either, but I like to point it out just as something to think about. I think that as we get to be a little bit older and older, then it should climb. I mean, our EQ, our emotional awareness, that tends to climb as we get through a little bit older. And then the last thing I'll say about this is that in a worldwide study of companies that were looking for hiring new employees, they took 67% over 33% who had EQ over economics. And I think there's a saying, I don't have the slide, but there's a saying that says in the boardroom, majority, I think it's 85% of decisions are made through emotion versus economics. So that's what I would say about that. And for self-awareness, I'll just dive right into the next slide here. And if you have any questions on anything that we're talking about, I see the numbers going up on the Q&A, but again, if you just pop your questions in there, then we're able to address them and answer them afterward. Okay, so self-awareness, what does that mean and what does it look like in terms of our emotional intelligence? So as Jennifer was saying, we've got these five quadrants that Daniel Goldman, who is the now popular person behind the literature of emotional intelligence, they're all interconnected. If you can see on the screen here, these little arrows, you really can't have one without the other. And if you're a box thinker like myself, it can be a little bit choppy to move from one realm to the other. And again, the self-awareness is being able to understand and be aware of how we move through life and how we move through these quadrants. And self-awareness also is key. This is one of the fundamental, this is the foundation of emotional intelligence. Self-awareness is that understanding of our own emotions. It's that connection of cause and effect. If we act poorly, then things don't necessarily happen for us in a positive way. Positive things happen to positive people, so to speak. Self-appreciation, acceptance, and confidence in order to understand who we are and the good qualities about ourselves to move through life in a self-aware way. We need to have to appreciate ourselves, have the confidence to appreciate ourselves. We also need to be conscientious and assertive, but not aggressive, assertive in a healthy way. And we also need the ability to identify our emotions. Now, this can be a bit of a struggle for people. Feel the feels. Easier said than done, but naming it, name it to tame it, they say. I work a lot with children and teens and self-regulation. So these are some of the tips that we use. And in order to know, or in order to fully embrace the self-awareness, we need to put ourselves in that place where we can understand how we're feeling in situations and how they show up for us and how that works for us. So I'm just showing you here a color wheel. Pardon me, not a color. It's colorful, yes, but it's actually an emotion wheel. And we chose to put this in because for some people, it is very difficult to understand and name the emotions. And that's what we're going to ask you to do next. I'm going to pass this over to Jennifer. She has a little self-reflection for us, but I'm just gonna pop this screen up so that people have maybe a little reminder of what it is we're talking about when we talk about emotions.
Thank you, Sherry. So I love this emotion wheel because it works with words, which are my way of working, and it works with the intensity of color, if that speaks to you. So the brighter and deeper the colors are, that shows the depth or intensity of the emotion, right? Intense color, intense emotions. So loathing is more intense than disgust, for example. Pensiveness is less intense than sadness. But the name it to tame it, the being able to name your emotions. A lot of research, and Brene Brown talks a lot about this if you're familiar with her work, say that there's a huge chunk of people out there, over 60%, maybe as high as 80%, who have a hard time going past mad, sad, glad. Like that's what they got when it comes to identifying their emotions. And so when we think about assessing yourself on an emotional intelligence scale, like self-aware, how self-aware am I? The low end of that would be not having an internal awareness of how your emotions and what you care about affect your mood, your body, and how you show up in the world. So if you are unaware that you're incredibly anxious about something and you're unaware of how that's affecting your body and affecting your human interactions, that would be low self-awareness. If If you get blindsided by sadness, like you don't know why it's showing up or why it's showing up suddenly, right? If your emotions surprise you a lot, that might be low on the self-awareness scale, whereas high on the self-awareness scale, and you get a gold star for finding my typo, which I only see once we are in present mode, right? Like, no, you never find a typo when you're looking at it 47 times. It's only when 100 other people are looking at it that you realize you can't type. So gold stars to those of you who saw that. Yep, thank you. So a high skill in self-awareness is, like, I have a deep knowledge of my inner emotional landscape that is connected to my values and goals and what motivates me and how I construct a meaningful life. So looking at that color wheel, like, I know what anxious feels like, and I know what disgust feels like. And I know when I'm mildly irritated and when I am white hot angry, and why I am white hot angry, right? The key here is the values and goals. Like, well, I'm angry. Why am I angry about that? Oh, because I'm experiencing a values conflict with this person, with this issue, with this policy, right? So that would be high skill. And so this is an opportunity for you to reflect on that, and to think about how in tune you are with your inner landscape. And next week, when we sort of revisit this again, we'll give you an opportunity to think about, like, what emotions do you give yourself permission to feel? And what emotions do you not give yourself permission to feel? People socialized as women and girls might not give themselves permission to feel angry. And so they might say, oh no, I'm not upset. I'm just a little frustrated. I see you, you're mad, right? People socialized as male might feel permission to be angry, but not feel permission to articulate sadness or disappointment, right? In themselves, or shame, right? Those sorts of things. So that's sort of the next level of this, is, do you see them? And do you recognize how they show up in your body, and can you name them accurately? Give yourself permission for that. So let me move myself to the next slide, which is social awareness. So social awareness is consideration of the feelings and responses of other people, right? It's reading the room. That's my favorite quick shorthand for it. It involves empathy and sensitivity to the moods and emotions of others. And when we're tuned in to the emotional vibe of a room, we're going to be more effective in communicating with people and connecting with people. So empathy and sensitivity. Social awareness also involves service and compassion. So are you aware of what people's needs are? Are you attuned to that? Situational perceptual awareness, like, oh, the mood just changed. Something happened, the mood just changed. What is that? Being attuned to that. It's sort of like having your antenna out a little bit. And it speaks to your ability to recognize potential in people, to develop skills in people, to develop relationships with people based on mutual interest, right? Like, oh, I recognize something in that person. Let me reach out to them and build a relationship, because you're attuned to how they show up in the world. So that's part of your social awareness. One of the skills that shows up in social awareness that I want to highlight is empathy. And I want to highlight it because I think so many people struggle with it. We're going to watch, if you haven't seen it already, you will love it. And if you have seen it already, you will love it again. We're going to watch this brief video by Brene Brown, and then we'll talk about it a bit, or I'll talk about it a bit.
And I apologize, I have to quickly stop sharing my screen so I can set up the volume, which I forgot to do, but that's okay. Here we go. Can everybody hear that? Jennifer, can you hear that?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Gosh, I love that. You want a sandwich? No, I don't want a sandwich. I want you to care. So empathy, I think it's a bear, right? It's a bear, it's a fox, and then deer. I don't know. Think of it as a gnu in some way. Like there's something about the face where I think it's an African gnu. Anywho, the bear has to find in himself the thing that allows him to empathize with the fox, right? You heard that I used to teach German. The word for empathy is feeling with in German. It's Mitgefühl, right? I feel with you. Not I feel for you, but I feel with you. And the bear's ability to access his own fear, his own overwhelmedness, is a key part of emotional intelligence. And when Sherry and I work with people in the positive intelligence framework, we talk a lot about empathy and how it has to start with self. And that means recognizing your own emotions, recognizing your own sadness, grief, overwhelm, excitement, love, joy, thrill, and recognizing that all of those emotions are valid and that you are worthy of compassion and love just as you are. And so that connection between self-compassion and compassion and empathy for others is really profound. And so again, that's another thing that we'll do a few tools next week, but pointing out the importance of that connection, I think is crucial here. It's hard to develop empathy when you live in criticism of self and others. Oh, I get to keep going? Holy cats.
You get to keep going. Yeah.
I get to keep going. All right, because we're talking about self-management. Like, why do I get self-management, man? Oh, what if you have too much empathy? Yeah, Olga, that's a good one. We'll take note of these, put that in the Q&A so we can capture it for next week. So self-management, self-control and discipline, but not like in the military sense of self-control and discipline. We're looking at self-evaluation and self-regulation to harness our feelings that impact our ability to achieve personal objectives. And I just read that off the slide. But so we're seeing in the the chat here that somebody says, well, if I talk to somebody who is suffering, I take that on, right? And suffer, and really suffer with them, as opposed to just feel with them. I get into their own suffering. And that is, I think that's a really powerful thing to bring up here, because it speaks to the self-management component of EQ, where, and to the self, it speaks to all of them. I'm trying to think through my head on my feet a little bit here. And as Sherry pointed out, they're so interconnected, and I'm gesturing with the pen. They're so interconnected. Like, if you are connected to your values and to and you know where your feelings show up, then when I come with my heavy, heavy, heavy story, are you grounded enough in yourself that my heavy story doesn't pull you off your base? And if you're not grounded enough in yourself and familiar enough with your own self, then maybe I can pull you off your base and bring you into my suffering. And then you're not in a great position to help, because you're as deep in the hole as I am, right? There's a connection and then a movement. If we think of, the video ended with the clouds turning into a heart, they connect. But the bear maybe has more resources in that moment than the fox. And so then the bear needs to manage their emotions. What is needed of me here? What emotion do I need to harness here for my own well-being, for the well-being of others, for the goals that we have? If the goal is to get out of the deep, dark hole, what resources do I have that I can intentionally harness to bring ourselves back up that ladder, right? So your motivation, the positivity that you can access, your own agility and creativity and adaptability lives in this self-management quadrant, where you're not being yoinked around by your emotions or other people's, right? Because if we're completely reactive to other people's emotions, we're not exhibiting remarkably high IQ, right? We're exhibiting maybe a really strong emotional awareness and identification, but it's not balanced out with self-management. It's not balanced out with relationship management. We are being pulled in reactive directions. So there's some building around self-management and connection to self and values that might counteract that reactivity. And here we have the same little scale that indicates low versus high skill, and here I think I was looking at trust and integrity. So one way, and there are all sorts of elements to self-management, but one of them is I can't trust anyone in my environment with my true motivations, my true goals, what I truly care about, right? This protectiveness, right? So that's maybe I'm overprotective of myself. Or on the high end, I feel clearly for myself and others about the criteria and the values that underpin decisions and actions, right? So there's an openness on the high end, and there's a closedness and tightness on the low end when it comes to are you sharing what motivates you? Are you sharing what grounds you? Are you sharing what you care about? So that you are acting in integrity and acting consistently, and other people see that as well in you, right? So those are the two ends of that spectrum.
Okay, thanks so much, Jennifer. That was fantastic. And thank you for that question on empathy. I don't want to continue too much down that path, but it's really key for this next quadrant that we're going to talk about is relationship management. Before we get started on that, I just wanted to mention to the person who said they feel this is a very, I don't want to say overly common thing, but it is, I do know a lot of people who can have that sense of really feeling for others, really suffering for them. And there's a term for that. It's an empath. So for those of you who had asked the question or are wondering about this, that's a little bit of research that you might be able to do on the side if you want to learn a little bit more about that. And also Jennifer and I love that Brene video. So this is why we love to talk about empathy as well. Going forward, we're going to be doing some training, I think in the fall here, for some resiliency. And resiliency, Jennifer and I will be doing some training for resiliency coaching, and its basis is empathy. So stay tuned for that. But at the same time, I bring it up because the empathy component is just as important as everything else. Although Goldman and others who have written the book, so to speak, on EQ and emotional intelligence, it's a subcomponent. I think it's really important to recognize that it's a huge part of today, right? We're in the middle of a global, hopefully at the end of a global pandemic. There's so much going on, like we can't even begin to unpeel the layers of what each of you are going through. So to be empathetic and to be self-aware and build that connectivity that Brene Brown was talking about in her video and that Jennifer was talking about, that's key to this relationship management. And so again, you'll see how well they're all interconnected. While I stress empathy is such a big part of it, there is also that service and compassion, and the holistic communication. And again, that draws on a little bit of what Jennifer was saying about how we can trust ourselves and trust, going back to that slide where the high, low in terms of trust. That is, when I hear that, or when I talk about trust, it's not just a trust of being able to be around others and trust what you tell them. When you fully trust and engage, you truly trust in your emotions and your feelings and where they guide you, right? It's a very difficult thing. They say the key to enlightenment is to fully trust. So it's not an easy path, but I think it's really important here to mention in terms of this relationship management. So again, here we're talking about developing relationships, getting along with others. And so you can see how being self-aware and being able to self-manage and being socially responsibility is really key here. Getting along with others. If you can't read the room, then it's really difficult to find that connection. We all know that person, right? That person who just keeps on talking, even though others have kind of maybe moved out of the room, or that person who just can't seem to know when to stop with perhaps sarcasm. We all have that uncle, or in my case, maybe sometimes my husband. So we all know those people. Also, when we're talking about relationship management, it is key for leadership and influence, right? We can't be so daft and unaware of how our emotions, the emotions that we're feeling and the emotions that we're having impact ourselves and our team. So in terms of leadership, again, going back to that the EQ versus IQ, good leaders have a good sense of understanding what their emotions are and how to place them in a healthy way, or how to use them in a healthy way. Change, catalyst, and response. So in terms of change, this isn't easy for a lot of people. Sometimes in an organization, we ourselves, or perhaps those that we're working with, have a tendency to roll our eyes. Oh boy, here we go, another change. This is that ability to prepare for that change, to be able, and it can be anything. Again, I work with youth, and a transition for my youth this is very difficult for them. So having a plan in place when we talk about that, and we'll talk about more of these tips, of course, next week. But being able to identify the emotion around the change. What is giving us this anxiety? What is giving us this fear, perhaps? Or maybe it's an excitement, right? And how can we harness that to work for our general well-being? And how can we harness it to make it work for us in general? Negotiation and conflict management. Okay, who has teams? We are all experts at negotiation and conflict management. Or are we? Do we do this in a healthy way? Your team comes to you and they're like off the rocker, they're here, you meet them here, there's a lot of emotion, we all do it, we get into a lot of negotiation and conflict management, but EQ will help us understand the emotions that get us here, and perhaps we can plan to draw it back a little in a healthy way. So that's really what all this is. All of the EQ that we're talking about is really how to move through your life Our general theme today was well-being. So all of these things and concepts that we're talking about are how to make them work in a healthy way for you and those around you, which brings us to teamwork and collaboration, which those who have a healthy sense of self-awareness, social awareness, and self-management are able to build and collaborate in a more positive way. Okay, so for the question here, so in terms of this low to high end scale, I want you to think for a few minutes on the times that you had to quickly adjust to change in your environment. So to what extent were you successful in making those changes? What kind of self-talk, motivation, and inner values did you have to draw on in order to change something in your behavior, perhaps in your work, in your environment? And how did this work for you? And think, while you're thinking of this, how did it work against you? So answering questions like this and taking some time to reflect on them will give you the opportunity to understand what the emotion is, how the emotion is working for you, and maybe some changes that you can make for yourself next time. So here the example is, I come across as self-absorbed, icy, and reserved, and have a mindset that success is a zero-sum game. So that there is actually a very low relationship management scale. And then we go to the higher end. I have a genuine ease of developing rapport and making connections between others, as well as the ability to ask questions that help others come to their own resonant answers. So that's on the high end. And right there, that little paragraph, really, I want to draw your attention on how that links to all that we've been talking about. It links to that relationship, developing the rapport, that's the interpersonal connections, and your making connections. That's that empathetic piece that Brene Brown was talking about. Building connection is getting in there with people, as well as the ability to ask questions that help others come across their own reminiscent answers. And so again, what Jennifer was talking about, that's that self-awareness. Pardon me, the social awareness, the read the room, and being able to understand where people are coming from and where, how you can build that relationship around that.
So here you can see where we've given you a couple free assessments to gauge your own EQ. So we'll leave this up for a few minutes. And then I'm going to invite, if we go into, I see that the Q&A has some action. And so I'll invite people to start populating the Q&A with additional questions, because we'll have some time for those. We kind of ran through the 4 pillars. And I want to start at the top with Kristen's question about that awesome emotion wheel. Sherry, where is that from?
Okay, nothing like putting me on the spot, Jennifer. You know what? I think it's from Positive Psychology.
Okay.
And I have that in my resources. I can actually, you know what? I'm going to backtrack for a minute. There was a few questions about, can we share the slides?
Those PowerPoints. Yep.
So yes, we can share the slides. And if you'd like to print that screen, you can. Yep. And if not, I can actually, you know what? Since I can't, I will just send the link to Sydney for the Positive Psychology, which is that color or emotion wheel.
Where does apathy show up on the wheel? Oh my goodness, that is so, yeah. Apathy, for me, I think apathy is sort of in that, in the blue, purple, green zone a little bit. But apathy is frequently a sign of depression, which is sort of a difficulty in regulating and recognizing emotional states, or an absence of emotional state. Like ongoing apathy, it isn't going to show up on an emotion wheel because it's when emotions have been cut off, right? And it's potentially clinical. So it's a really good question. When Sherry mentioned that this resource and one of the freely available EQ assessments is we've got from a website called Positive Psychology. As a branch of psychology, positive psychology and cognitive psychology form a lot of the foundations of emotional intelligence work and other work that works on the premise that like life is 50-50. 50% of the time it's grand, and 50% of the time it is not grand. And so what do we do when it's not grand? Right? And how can we maybe engage in negativity less and bring more positivity into our lives through our own cognitive and emotional abilities? And so when you get to apathy, it's like, oh man, positive psychology and cognitive psychology don't have a ton of tools for something like apathy, for something like depression. We're working on the assumption that people are naturally creative, resourceful, and whole. And you are naturally creative, resourceful, and whole. And so where do you start in sort of making that shift from what is below disgust in that purple?
That's boredom.
Oh, boredom?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that might be sort of in the apathy zone as well. But we're working on the premise that let's say you're bored, that instead of moving towards loathing, you move out of boredom towards something else. You know, maybe you're moving towards acceptance or serenity, or right, if that is part of what you want to do, right? If you want to spend more time in the positive, how do you do that? Okay, we're going to send along with the slides. I have a little bibliography of pretty accessible EQ scholarship. Anonymous attendee, autism and social cues.
So I'm mulling that one. I do believe that I can send there is special training for those individuals who would like to learn some of these skills. I have a little bit of a toolbox of ADHD more so than autism, but I'm sure we can send something. Is there something in particular that you're looking for? Is it this? Okay.
I think there is, to answer Olga's question about the students recognizing their feelings. And yeah, many people don't know exactly what they're feeling. That is the first step. Can you identify? And there are, and that's something that we can include in next week's longer, more tools focused session. But just as a brief primer, it really is, it's about practice and self-reflection, right? It is, most EQ and other sort of positive psychology-based programs, and this goes hand in hand with cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavioral therapy, is some kind of journaling where maybe you start in the body. And I don't know if this is, if this would be part of a way to get autistic individuals or people who are on that spectrum to tap into emotions as well. But frequently, if we can't put a name to emotions, our body is sending us signals that we're not reading. Like, when is our throat tight? When do we have butterflies in our stomach? When do we feel kind of jittery and shaky? Can we, day by day, make a record of what was the strongest emotion I was aware of feeling? What was my body doing then? How do I connect them? So it really is rather personalized, detailed work of noticing, reflecting, and then noticing and reflecting again. And looking at something like the color wheel or these high-low scales, I'm just finalizing a worksheet that does sort of that high-low thing again, but for 5 different areas, that I can probably include next week, that sometimes even looking at those questions can raise awareness. Like, oh, people have said that they find me icy and reserved. I don't feel icy and reserved. What's the disconnect there? Let's see here. Okay, so we'll see if we find any resources on EQ and autism. I think that is such a good question. And I imagine there's a large body of research on it, or at least a growing body of research on it. I'll see what I can find between now and next week. I'm writing that down, autism research. That is interesting. And then Arthur's question about empaths versus narcissists. Sherry, you want to take on the narcissists?
I don't know if I do a really good job of this one. It's not my area of expertise, but when we can talk about boundaries, right? Like this, having an emotional intelligence is about having boundaries in terms of protecting ourselves from a narcissist, or protecting ourselves as an empath, or just protecting ourselves as a general human being. These boundaries are things that you have to determine on your own. And I'm going to go back to what Jennifer was saying about first of all, there's this wheel, like how are we feeling? We can identify those feelings. If we're really good at that, then we don't necessarily need to tap into our own bodies. But I do know if I come across, folks who are dealing with bullies, that tends to lead to anxiety, right? So if we talk about narcissists kind of being on the attack, you're feeling that as an empath. What you want to do is really pay attention to, are your palms getting sweaty? Is your heart pounding? Then that is an immediate flag that you need to put those boundaries up right there, right? And then you can use that to move the dial on those boundaries by tuning into how much you're okay with being an empath and feeling those narcissistic kind of attacks, so to speak. Yeah, so it's a really personal thing. Tune into how you're feeling. Take a minute when they come at you. Think about are you okay with what you're feeling? I'm feeling anxious. I'm feeling like my boundaries I don't have boundaries. I don't have any assertiveness. And maybe that's okay. Maybe in that situation, that's okay for you, right? This is a very personal thing. You have to be able to determine where your boundaries are best for you. So I suggest that you tune into identifying what it is you're feeling, but as well as an empath, you probably already are quite good at tuning into that physical sensation as well, and paying attention to when that flag needs to go up to determine those boundaries. And then when you're determining boundaries, you're going to be looking at assertiveness. Your sense of assertiveness, your confidence. These are the things, the sub-skills that we didn't have time to get into today. But if you're interested, these are the things also we can do these assessments for and coach on.
And to build on that, Sherry said assertiveness, and I see in the chat, Karen is talking about boundaries as well. And I mean, we code empathy culturally in North America as positive. Especially for women, but it's coded positively in general. Olga makes a point in the Q&A that if you're an international student or new to Canada, you're coming with different codes. Do you know how to express emotions in a way that's acceptable here? Do you have the linguistic ability to do that, right? So all of this, it has cultural as well as personal implications. But when Sherry mentioned boundaries and the word that starts with an A, Sherry? Assertiveness. There you go. It was going to come to me eventually. The other thing that one of the EQ assessments that we work in measures is independence, which in this particular context means how confident are you in reading your instincts, your gut feelings, assessing them and making decisions because you know that you're making the right decision for yourself, versus how much extra assurance or handhold, I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit here, hand-holding or buy-in from other people do you need in order to have that confidence? And so you can see that maybe like in parenting, having those borders and boundaries may take one shape, and at the workplace, it may take a different shape, right? Depending on what kind of boundary serves you best there, whose emotions you want to make yourself available to, right? And whose emotions you don't, right? Arthur says in the Q&A, sometimes hypervigilance leads to paranoia. Exactly. So we're looking at balance here. And one of the free assessments that I think, let me see if I can see the slide with the free assessments on it. You'll get that is at positiveintelligence.com. At the top of positiveintelligence.com, it says
there it is.
Saboteurs. There's an assessment there that it doesn't use EQ language. It says positive intelligence instead of emotional intelligence. They're kind of like ice cream and sorbet, maybe, like they're very related. And hypervigilant is one of the saboteur voices. And so this point about hypervigilance going into paranoia, sure. Hypervigilance also has, like in a small dose, before it becomes hyper, like you're aware of risks, personally, socially, right? That's a good thing. If it becomes the way you lead all of your interactions, if that's your primary focus, has it gone from being a strength in small doses to being a potential weakness because it blinds you to other realities? Yeah. Well, and hyper-vigilant means like there's a bit too much, right? There's maybe a foundational, yeah, I am risk aware, and maybe I have proof in my past history to show me that being risk aware is good because there are risks and there are dangers. If that risk awareness and that vigilance is shutting you off to meaningful human interaction, if that is shutting you off from setting reasonable goals for yourself and achieving them, if it's shutting you off from happiness, then maybe it has gone past the point where it serves you and needs to be reined in a little bit and maybe balanced out with another emotional component, right? Trust, compassion for self and others, right? There are other creativity, generosity. These other things can come in and balance that out a bit, so that something like vigilance or something like control, right? Like I love people who can take control of a situation, but if that's their only horse, that's their hammer and everything is a nail, right? You want to be able to balance, okay, here's the 20% of the time when I need to be vigilant, when I need to be in control, when the I's need to be dotted and the T's need to be crossed. 80% of the time, I can maybe be happy with good enough, right? So, and that speaks, which component, I think it's in at least 2 or 3 of, it's the awareness, both of the awareness components, like, can you effectively gauge?
Yeah. The self-regard, the assertiveness, the independence.
Yeah, can you effectively gauge, is this important enough for me to go into that really profound emotional space, or is this not quite that important, right? So that effective gauge of, is this a reasonable conclusion to draw? Do I need to be that much in control? Do I need to be that vigilant? That's also like balancing that is also part of EQ.
Jennifer, well said, of course. There's 2 questions here that I'd like to take a stab at before we run out of time.
Mm-hmm.
Olga, I see yours was already filed as answered, but you were asking about student assessments. So this is basically how Jennifer and I met. We were developing a student profile and we're still working on it to put into school. So if there's something that we can help you with, and I see that the positive psychology or Psychology Today, there was a link that was sent to you. That's great. It's a very useful link. But if there's something you're thinking about for a group of students, this is where we shine. So if there's something we can help you out with, our contacts are here at the back. Let us know and we'll help you build something for that. If it's just for your one student, for all the folks that are listening who might have an interest in getting their one or two or their own children assessed, the EQ tool that we use, there is one specific for students, right? So it's a little bit modified. It helps them, students navigate that place between, we both have children or young adults, that place between high school and university, and making their way and using the EQ strategies and tools to be more self-aware and engaged and assertive, getting into their first years of university or post-secondary education. So we do some work on that. So if anybody's interested, by all means, let us know. The other question I wanted to address was anonymous with I'm assuming this is the one with the autism. So we're talking about looking at the emotional wheel and what are some of the exercises that we can implement in a situation in order to prevent progress into the darker colors. So for this one, this is really a fundamental part of what the tool can do for you. So for here, we'll address some of this stuff. We don't have time today, but we'll put that in our toolbox for next week when we're talking about tools. Great question. Thank you very much. But this again this is the foundation of what the EQ tool can do. So if you are interested in learning more on that, doing the assessment and then having a one-on-one coach sounds like it would really kind of be the way for you to go. And I'm seeing also in the chat from Sydney that there's a link to this week's webinar already, and I take that as we're tying up. So I'll stop talking now. It's been such a pleasure having you all here.
And I've taken notes from this week's webinar for things that we can specifically pick up next week, so that if you haven't already registered for next week, go ahead and do it. If you think people might be interested, but they didn't attend this week's, that's fine. Please come, because we'll probably start with, here are the pillars, and the 4 pillars of EQ, here's the emotions wheel, and then we'll go into things like resonance, like what does it mean to be aware of your values and your goals and find resonant choices. I think that's a good word. And we'll look at moving towards positivity and not moving towards the more intense negative emotions. Yeah, I took notes. I'm sure Sherry took notes. We'll do things. Olga, let's see, we're at 12:59, so I'm not gonna answer any more questions, but the slide that you can see here is both Sherry and I are on LinkedIn. And I guess I heard from Continuing Ed that a lot of you found this through the Facebook page. I'm there too, look me up. If you are in academia, like if you're affiliated with MacEwan and interested in that, I have a group called Energized Academic, and talking about positive psychology and mindfulness when it comes to being a professional someplace in the ivory tower is what I do there. But either on LinkedIn or on Facebook, find us and ask these questions, and then more people can hear the answers. Like if we can't get them all done here, we can build that conversation out elsewhere. Of course, you're allowed to be here, Karen. Of course, I've seen some people in the chat referring to their students. I'm like, okay, like there's another space that does that, but no, here we are just sharing information that I hope is super valuable. I think the engagement has been lovely, and there's a whole lot to cover here. Thank you so much. Is there anything else we need to show them slide-wise, Sherry? Or
no, we're at the end of our slides. But oh no, I'm so sorry. There was yes, next week a reminder for the 27th, where we'll do this emotional intelligence again with tools. There's a link here to MacEwan Continuing Education if you have any questions as well. Their social media links are down here also.
Thank you very much, Jennifer and Sherry. That was fantastic. A lot of great questions. I think everyone's really excited about next week. Sounds like you've got your work cut out for you in terms of what we can do with that. But that's the beauty of EQ. I guess there's so many different applications. So we want to thank everyone for coming, and big thanks to Sherry and Jennifer. Jennifer, if you had any closing thoughts, I'll leave it with you.
No, I find these super energizing. I'm glad that we don't have next week all hammered out perfectly, because getting feedback in real time allows us to be flexible with what we're going to include next week. So, and yeah, and we're happy to be local resources and do more of this. So please reach out, because yeah, like Sherry said, this is where we hang out. Talking about EQ all the time.
It's our jam.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks very much, everyone. Thanks, Sydney.
Thanks, everyone.
So is the webinar still on, Sydney?
The recording?
The recording's still on. Are folks